Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with expert knowledge from professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Yastra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's get started. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. We're going to be talking about sustainable living at home today with Jess. Before we get going, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name's Jess Harrison. I'm the team leader of sustainability planning at City of Greater Dandenong here in Melbourne, and I'm also currently the secretary of the South East Council's Climate Change Alliance, or SECA, which is a group of 9 councils in South East Melbourne working together to tackle climate change.
That sounds amazing, and that sort of fits into what we're going to be talking about today, which is great. But first we'll move on to have you met Jess. So it's a bit of an introduction to you. So what's your favourite book?
I think it would have to be Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a Native American woman, and she's also a trained botanist and ecologist. So it's a non-fiction book, but it ties together beautifully science, traditional knowledge, and just the idea of a relationship with nature. So highly recommend.
That sounds like a great book. What's a movie you've seen recently?
I took my mum to see Where the Crawdads Sing on the weekend. It was pretty good, but we were joking going into it, like, do crawdads actually sing? And we didn't find out. So there were no singing crawdads.
I don't even know what a crawdad is.
It's a freshwater crustacean.
Okay.
So I think here in Australia we call them crayfish, but yeah, different names around the world, which is interesting.
Yeah. Is there a podcast you're listening to at the moment?
I've been listening to a lot of Science Versus, which is a fantastic show that takes a lot of like scientific principles and stories and just explains them and breaks them down in a really interesting and engaging way.
Yes, I also listen to that podcast and I really like it. Do you have a role model that you look up to?
I think it'd have to be Jane Goodall. She's done so much for naturalism and our understanding of social life in non-human species. So yeah, definite professional crush on her.
And have you completed a course recently, or was there one that you really enjoyed?
The most recent course I did was actually, I got my motorbike learner's permit a couple of weeks ago. So in Victoria, you have to do a mandatory 2-day course to get your permit. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Is there a particular reason that you've decided to use a motorbike?
It's been a bit of a bucket list item for a long time, but in the spirit of, trying not to waste materials and just a general principle of trying not to buy new things without good reason. My poor car that I've had since I was 17 that has been through a lot, it's on its last legs, and I've been thinking for a while, like I hardly drive, but I do have to sometimes head out to the country to see my parents, and I've got a horse, a pet horse, so need to go out and feed him. But for a long time I've been thinking, why am I driving this car that could fit 5 people just by myself? So yeah, switching to 2 wheels just to try and cut down on some emissions there.
Yeah, I definitely think that when I'm driving my car, I'm like, I only ever drive with at most 2 people and some groceries in here.
Exactly.
I don't think a motorbike would maybe work because groceries, I don't know where you'd put them.
Yeah, I mean, you can get storage solutions for motorbikes, or you can ride with a backpack, but I must admit I haven't tried that yet. So if you see someone like fallen over on the side of the road in Melbourne with a bunch of groceries scattered around, please stop and help me.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I'd love a car that was just big enough for that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So how would you define household management?
Yeah, well, I must admit, I hadn't necessarily heard of that term before learning about this podcast. So I just started thinking about, what that kind of means for me and how I manage my house. And I think the way we look at our houses has definitely shifted over the last couple of years with COVID. So, previously my house was just completely my own safe space. It was kind of a little retreat, safe haven from the world. Now it's also my office part of the time too. So I think it really embodies the values that I have. A lot of my furniture is secondhand. There's a lot of plants and things around. I've got a little worm farm out on my balcony to avoid food waste. So, yeah, I think, your house is kind of the center of your world in some ways. And I think it really needs to define you and what you're about in life. So,
I love that. I guess definition. It's so different from I think what other people have said, but it's still keeping. I guess in it's everything that you do at home, and for you it's partly your identity. I guess. What do you think people get wrong with household management?
I don't know if there's a wrong necessarily. There's probably just improvements that could be made, glass half full. If I look at it through a lens of sustainability, I think two of the biggest things are food waste and wasteful consumption of energy. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit later.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So I guess what is sustainable living?
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably two terms I should define just before we get started, and that would be sustainability and climate change, because the two are very closely linked together. So I won't go into a full explanation of what climate change is, but super briefly, climate is basically just looking at the average weather conditions over a really long period of time. And what we know since temperature started to be recorded in the 19th century is that as a trend, global temperatures have been rising for a very long time. Currently, we're an average of about 1.2 degrees warmer than we were back in the 19th century. And that doesn't sound like very much, but it really is when you look at all of the delicate processes and balances in the world that are required to sustain life. So we know that that's strongly correlated with human activity. So when we do things like we burn coal to generate electricity or we drive around in our cars, we're generating these things called greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions. You'll sometimes hear them called as well. And that's basically like a big blanket surrounding the Earth's atmosphere, trapping the sunlight and heat. And so the world gets warmer and warmer as we continue to generate these emissions. So that's what climate change is. I would say that sustainability is recognising that the world has finite resources and trying to live your life in a way that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs through the Earth's resources. So we know that with climate change, if it continues to get warmer and we don't, put a cap on the temperature increase, eventually all of Earth's ecosystems will fail. The Earth will no longer be able to sustain life. So I think sustainability and climate action really go hand in hand.
I guess what can we do, in the house to make it more sustainable?
It's a big question.
Or maybe just start with one and we'll do multiple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest things we can do is around behaviour change. That's a really good place to start. And I guess tying back into that concept of household management and how people actually manage their lives from their house, it's a really natural way or place to start is in the home. So just talking about what I was saying before about energy consumption, we know that around about 40% of emissions globally come from our buildings, including our homes. So it's quite a large component of emissions. And of course, it varies across the world. And I know you'll have listeners in other countries as well, not just here in Australia. So in Melbourne in particular, our houses, especially our older houses, tend to be pretty poor in terms of insulation. There's a lot of, heating or air conditioning leaking through gaps in the walls or the roof or even the floor. So that can be really difficult over winter for people to keep comfortable and warm. One of the things you can do is just try to warm yourself first. So rather than heating the entire house, put on extra clothes, have a hot water bottle, have a blanket, see how you go. If you're still cold, try to just heat the room you're in if possible. So close all the doors off. Try and just use heating as sparingly as possible. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit more later about what renters specifically can do, because that's another kind of challenge. But yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good place to start.
Yeah, so I know for me at the beginning of winter, I'm always freezing cold, even though it's roughly the same temperature the whole winter, or it only gets colder from there. And then I sort of just acclimatize and I'm like, I'm just cold now every day. Yeah, so I remember but the first month my heating bill was huge. I think it was partly because of the price increases in energy, but also
Yes.
because we were just, closing off one room and putting the heater on all day and sitting right next to that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, do you have any suggestions? You suggested wrapping ourselves up more warmly. I guess using the heater is okay when you are sort of reaching the end of like, I can't put any more clothes on without losing the ability to bend my arms. Would you say that that's okay?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of times people tend to beat themselves up about things related to sustainability and climate change. The amount of friends who have shown up to meet me for a walk and they've got their little disposable coffee cup and they're like, I'm sorry, Jess, I forgot my reusable cup. Like, don't worry about it. We don't need people to be doing things perfectly. We need a lot of people to be doing things imperfectly and just trying their best. And I think the point you made about the increase in energy cost is really, really important as well. There's this topic of energy poverty where people, oftentimes renters, have to make the choice between either being really cold and suffering or running their heater, but then facing a massive bill. And there's a link I can add into the show notes later, which is a study that came out yesterday around that topic, which is really interesting. But I think for renters specifically, and within Australia, you can have a look at the Energy Compare website, which will tell you if you're on the best deal. So might be some potential savings there. But yeah, I mean, like health has to come first, and the topic of health and climate change is really related. But again, you're only one person, you have limited levers of control. You often, especially as a renter, won't necessarily have much choice over what kind of house you live in or, the ability to re-insulate a house, for example. So I think you can only do what you can do. If you're trying and you're being mindful of that, then that's a really good start, and that's what we need.
That's good to hear because, again, there's only so much we can do sometimes. With different types of heaters, do you know anything about that? Because we had this really old one in my house, and it made a lot of noise, and it didn't heat the room very efficiently. So we actually asked the landlords to replace it with something more efficient.
Right.
But I was wondering afterwards, is it actually more efficient? Would you able to speak about that?
Yeah, of course. So what kind of heater was your old one, aside from really noisy?
I'm not really sure. It's electric.
It's electric. Okay.
Yeah.
Was it a wall?
It was
wall heater.
And the new one is also a wall heater,
Okay. Interesting.
but it's quieter.
It's quieter. Okay. Well, that's probably a good sign. Pretty much the most efficient method of heating and cooling you can get is a reverse cycle split system. So an AC unit that also does heating. And that's commonly what the old kind of gas wall heaters are being replaced with now, especially in rentals or units or apartment buildings. Something that's really common in Victoria as well is ducted gas heating, and that's quite inefficient. But yeah, the wall heaters are pretty much the least efficient out of any heating options. So I'm quite surprised that your owner of the building decided to replace like for like.
They did actually look at putting a reverse cycle in, but they couldn't do it because of the structure of the building or something.
Yeah, and that's a real challenge, especially because you're in a multi-story apartment building. Yeah, me too. So the owner of my apartment put a split system in back in January this year, and they had to put in the ducting in a really weird way, kind of through the window. And it looks a bit janky, but it does the job. And just from personal experience, so yeah, I'm renting a one-bedroom 70s era apartment. Last winter, I didn't have any heating. So I had a tiny little electric fan heater that I would only use when I got really desperate. And because we were in lockdown a lot of winter last year, I was home a lot. So I'd put it on just for a couple of hours because I'd be trying to work from home. I'm taking my own advice. I'm in my winter coat and beanie and gloves trying to type on my keyboard, and my fingers are frozen and I can't feel them. So I would put the little fan heater on just for a couple of hours. And I've been comparing my bills this winter compared to last. And even though I have been using the split system a little bit more than I would have been using the fan heater, my bills are half the cost.
Wow.
Compared to last year. So
I heard that those fan heaters are really not very good.
Oh, they're terrible. Yeah. But, again, there's only so much you can do, and you need to be able to be comfortable in your house. And, if you're working from home, you need to be able to feel your fingers to type. So I try to make sure everyone understands, you don't need to feel guilty about doing things like that. It's really important that people do kind of take responsibility, I guess, for their own part to play in sustainability and climate change. But this whole thing is so much bigger than just one individual person putting on the heater for a few hours so that they don't freeze. Yeah.
So what other things can we do to make the house more sustainable?
There's a few. So food waste is another big one. So a lot of people don't realise that when we waste food or we send food to landfill, it actually, as it breaks down, generates carbon emissions as well. So it does contribute to the greenhouse gases and climate change. So what you can do is, number one, try to not waste food where you can. Easier said than done sometimes as someone who has quite a small stomach. Sometimes, you go out to a restaurant, you're not too sure what the portion size is going to be, and, you can't eat it all. So, just if you can, try to bring that home and eat it for lunch the next day.
Also saves you some money. You don't have to buy lunch or don't have to, purchase food for lunch the next day.
Exactly, 100%. I feel like a lot of these kind of sustainability tips have the added bonus of saving money as well, which is always a good thing. But I mentioned before, I've got a little worm farm at home, just on my balcony. And, I grew up with parents who were fairly eco-conscious. We lived out in the Dandenongs around Melbourne in the forest there. And we always had a compost heap growing up. So it was just totally normal. And when I moved out and moved into a share house, that became much less achievable, I guess. So when I moved out on my own, I was like, I've got an apartment with a balcony. Like, what solutions are there now to be kind of avoiding sending food to landfill? And my local council was doing a program where they give you 50% off on various composting solutions. So there's also something called a bokashi bin, I think it's called. I can send the link later if anyone's interested. But that's a solution for people who don't even have balconies. So it just sits in your kitchen and it breaks down food waste. It's all contained, so you don't have to worry about any smells or anything like that. So there's been a lot of progress made, I think, in this space over the last couple of years. And I use the castings from my worm farm on my plants, and I've been trying to grow some herbs and things on the balcony as well, cutting down on the herbs I have to buy from the supermarket that come, packaged in plastic, which I try to avoid.
And then what happens with my herbs that I buy from the supermarket is I end up throwing away half of them because they wilt in the fridge.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And that contributes to wastage, I guess.
That's true. A good hack for that one is if your herbs are looking a bit sad, you can try putting them in a bowl of ice water. That sometimes will give them a little bit of life back. But if they're really kind of about to go, you can chop them up and freeze them in little ice cube trays. Then when you want to use them in cooking in the future, you just kind of chuck an ice cube of basil into your pasta. Or
that's great because, I buy a bunch of pasta, and basil right now is so
yes.
all herbs are expensive.
True.
But, and I buy them, and I'm like, it's $5 worth of basil, and I only get a little bit out of it, and then I end up throwing it away. But
exactly.
And then I'm like, it's been so good to have basil pasta.
True. It's I have a incredible weakness for pesto pasta. Favorite comfort food.
Yeah, same. I love pesto pasta.
Yeah, completely understand.
So for people who don't know, what is a worm farm?
So a worm farm, the one I have is kind of a little, I want to say it's maybe a little bit less than a metre tall. It's fairly, I'm gesturing for those who are just listening and can't see. It's fairly compact. So it's got two little trays in it. In the bottom, you put your worms. So you can buy worms from a couple of different places. If you're in Australia, Bunnings sells them. They're called red wrigglers. That's the typical breed that you get. So I got about 1,000 worms. That's kind of the starter pack, I guess. So they live in the bottom tray. Then in the top tray is where you put all your food scraps. So you just pour them in. The worms, it's kind of like a sieve kind of, or sieve kind of barrier between the two trays so they can come and go.
Okay.
So the worms wriggle up and they start munching on all of your food scraps. And as they break the food scraps down, it kind of turns into this really fine kind of dirt-like consistency, and you can then use that on your garden or on your indoor plants. It's a really effective fertilizer. So, yeah.
And what can you put in the worm farm? Like, can you put all foods there?
Almost everything. The only real no-no is bones or meat scraps. So if you do that, you'll get maggots and it will not be a good time. So the bokashi bin that I was talking about before, that does, you can put meat scraps or bones in that. That will break it down. But yeah, the worms will eat pretty much anything. Even things like old paper, they'll munch through happily. The dirt from your vacuum cleaner can go in there as well, which sounds really weird.
Can it eat cat fur?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, because
yeah.
that's mostly what's in my vacuum cleaner.
Yes, yeah, exactly. always shedding.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be fine. They're not very fussy, so
Okay.
yeah, they're good allies in the climate change fight.
And the bokashi, so is that just like a bin?
Yeah, it's again a closed kind of bin. It's fairly small, kind of like the size of a little like tin that you might have for tea or coffee, a little bit bigger, and that uses some chemicals to break things down. I'm not exactly sure specifically of the process, so I will send a link if people want to learn more. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but yeah, friends that I know that have them say they work pretty well, and that's a good solution if you don't have an outdoor space or a balcony as well.
Yeah, because what I have in my council is we just have a big green bin
Yes.
that you just kind of chuck all the food scraps in.
Okay, cool.
But in summer, you open the lid and a swarm of like bugs just come
Oh,
out,
yeah.
and it's awful. It smells terrible as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think that's a really common concern, especially with the big communal bins. And it can be really hard if you're sharing with neighbours and they don't necessarily understand, what can and can't go in there. One of the hacks to help with smells in that kind of situation is you can wrap your food scraps in newspaper or kind of any old paper that you have lying around. And that will help absorb some of the liquid and
okay.
some of the smells. So that helps a little bit with flies. But also coffee grounds, if you're recycling those in the green bin, they're really effective at absorbing all the smells in particular. So yeah.
Yeah, we do recycle our coffee grounds, but maybe not enough.
Yeah, I guess you're just going to have to drink more coffee then.
Okay. Well, I guess if I have
I
to.
know. Oh no, what a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, so other than food waste and heating, are there any other things that we can do?
Yeah, it's probably a big one for listeners in the Middle East around water conservation. So at the moment in Australia, most of the eastern coast of Australia has been experiencing floods. So we're okay in terms of conserving water, but in places like the UAE, that's obviously a huge issue for them. So some of the things you can do is if you have a look at what products you're using in the shower, have a look and see if you can find products that say they're greywater friendly. If you can incorporate those, you can then have a little just like bucket in the shower when you're having a shower to collect some of the water. And you can use that to water your plants or out in the garden, to wash down paths or areas outside that are dusty, things like that. That's probably the biggest tip to save water. I know in Victoria, private development, so new residential areas being built, are mandated to have rainwater tanks, which is fantastic. So they're commonly connected to toilet flushing at home. But if you don't have that option, if you're renting, you could also look at things like water efficient shower heads. That's probably the main thing you could do as a renter.
So is that something that you can just unscrew the old one and just put a new one on?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
For most showers, yeah.
Okay.
And quite a few local council areas in Victoria are engaging with a free shower head upgrade program. So you might be wandering through the shopping centre and see someone standing at a little booth offering away free water efficient shower heads. So yeah, just keep an eye out and see what's available because you might be able to get a free one, which is always good.
Yeah, I have a feeling that I need to go onto my council website and see what they're offering.
Definitely.
Yeah, see if they're offering anything interesting that I can take advantage of.
Yeah, for sure. 'Cause, I think you said you're in Melbourne's north, and a couple of the council areas around there, they have fantastic sustainability programs. They're really, really engaged. So
I do have a feeling that my council probably would be engaged, but I just haven't taken advantage, I guess, because I just haven't known that was a possibility, I guess, which is it's great to learn these things because not only will I reduce my water usage, but I'll reduce my bill again.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's an added bonus.
Yeah.
With pretty much every utility is rising in cost at the moment. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's I think one of the biggest ways that we engage with the general public about this issue. You know, even if you don't care about climate change or the planet specifically, a lot of people care about their savings and their wallet. So, yeah, it's really great that a lot of these initiatives have that added bonus of saving money too.
A question I did have about the greywater. So I guess when I have a shower and it goes down the drain, I guess what I imagine happens is it just gets processed and cleaned. But if I were to start using is the products that we use normally, is that bad for the environment? Should we be going specifically for the greywater products?
I think it's a great idea if you can. So, yeah, in Melbourne, the water does get processed and cleaned at water treatment plants, but there's always going to be, leaks along the way. If there's flooding, those chemicals and things can get out into the waterways and into our environment. They can affect our wildlife negatively. So cleaning products in particular around your home, it's always a good idea if you can go for the greywater friendly option, because then you know for sure, even if there is, a leak somewhere along the way, or if there's an event and those cleaning products are released into the environment, it's not going to hurt anything. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. I'll have to have a look at all of my products. I think they're probably not very good.
There's a lot of alternatives these days is the good thing. So some of them you can't find at your typical supermarket, but there's a lot of eco-friendly stores that are popping up these days, stores where you can buy things in bulk, package-free. And even I think one of the Coles here in Melbourne is trialling like a self-serve cleaning product packaging-free station where you can just take in a jar and go and, press a button and have it filled up with washing detergent, for example. So, yeah, it's great. It's definitely a lot better than it was a couple of years ago.
So this sort of brings to mind, it sounds more expensive and less convenient to do that. Is there this sort of balance between those two when you're looking at sustainability, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think for a long time, especially when I first got into this area about 10 years ago, sustainability really was kind of a privileged thing. It was more expensive to live sustainably, and totally understand, I'm speaking from a position of someone who lives alone, who doesn't have a family to take care of as well. I have the time and the money to really engage with these things. So I think that's probably really important to acknowledge. But I think the real benefit, especially of the things like the bulk stores where you can get, really concentrated laundry detergent, for example, it might seem like it's a bit more expensive, but it's going to last a lot longer because you're not just paying, for water.
Yeah.
It's really concentrated. And that's a really common theme with these sustainable products. A lot of the times they are a lot kind of stronger gram for gram compared to the traditional products. But I think as well, if you're implementing kind of all of these things at once, the savings on your utilities like your energy, your water, are hopefully going to offset some of the maybe slight increases where you're paying for the more eco-friendly products, at least in theory.
And I guess with the convenience as well, like it's very easy for, and it is a bit easier for me, I guess, because I live in an area where there is quite a focus on this type of thing. So I know there's a shop near me that does eco-friendly products. But if I run out of washing detergent at 10 o'clock at night, where am I going to go? I'm going to go to the supermarket.
Yeah, of course.
Because that's what's open and that's what's near me.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I guess, does this mean you have to be really great at planning and you have to spend a lot of time thinking about sustainability?
I think it definitely helps to have a bit of a plan. And I think that's a really great point that you made, that a lot of these things aren't as immediately accessible as a lot of the supermarket items are. And again, I think it just comes back to trying your best. You know, if you run out of laundry detergent at 10 o'clock at night and you really need to wash your work clothes the next day, like, the earth will forgive you. Don't worry about that. You're still trying. You know, it takes time to change. Like, humans don't like change. That's totally normal. We get kind of stuck in our comfort zones, and that's just a real human thing. I think we just need to be patient with ourselves and be kind to ourselves as well. You know, what we were talking about before about limited levers of control around our own kind of emissions and carbon footprint. There are entire, like, large corporations that emit more than whole countries. So,
Wow.
you know, when you put it in context like that, it's great that people want to make individual change and, you know, take accountability for themselves and try and live more sustainably. And I think that is really important still. But in the context of, you know, the broader world, corporations and governments need to take on their fair share as well. So, you know, if you forget your keep cup at the cafe a couple of times and you get a takeaway coffee, or if you need to buy, you know, traditional laundry detergent from the supermarket, that's okay.
What can we do about, I mean, maybe there isn't anything we can do, but is there anything we can do to like get governments and organizations to sort of go to stand more strong on
Yeah,
climate change?
definitely. I think use your voice and use your money to vote. So look into candidates that support climate action, that support sustainability. When there is an election, do your research. You can write letters to politicians encouraging them to vote on important issues related to climate change. Have a look and see what programs your local government offers. For example, at Dandenong, we have a community sustainability advisory committee. So we have about 8 people who are either living or working in Greater Dandenong, and they come and tell us what's important to them. And that forms the basis of a lot of our policies and programs at a local government level. Call out corporations that are doing the wrong thing. You know, try not to support them if you can avoid it. Money speaks very loudly, and if your dollars are going to corporations that are being responsible and are doing the right thing, things will gradually change. And I think one of the biggest things you can do is have a look at your bank accounts, have a look at your superannuation. If you are someone who invests, take a look at your portfolio. If any of you know, your banks or your super funds or your investments support fossil fuels or things related to climate change and global warming, consider switching to a more ethical alternative that doesn't. Renewable energy, in particular, is a huge area of growth at the moment. There's a lot of startups and great technological firms doing great things that would gladly take your money if you wanted to invest in them. So,
That sounds great. I'll have to look. I've had my bank for so long. My parents signed me up. I didn't have any choice there. I'll have to see what they're doing. It sounds like something easy enough to do.
yeah, it's a simple Google. Yeah.
So before we get into the next section, what is like a carbon or ecological footprint?
Yeah. So both of these things are related, but they're slightly different. An ecological footprint basically has a look at the total resources needed to sustain the world if everyone chose to live like you. So it's basically looking at your lifestyle, some of the choices that you make around your house and the way you kind of get around. And it looks at the total land area, so things like forest and grassland, the total amount of water and ocean. And as part of an ecological footprint, it also looks at your carbon footprint. So an ecological footprint contains a carbon footprint component, but a carbon footprint doesn't contain an ecological footprint, if that makes sense. And I think we'll link to a footprint calculator in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to calculate theirs. But a carbon footprint is basically looking at how many resources you're consuming from a carbon emissions perspective. So it's saying you, Jess Harrison, use this amount of resources and you're emitting this amount of emissions into the Earth's atmosphere every year. So it's a really helpful way of contextualizing how you as an individual have an impact on the world. And it also, I think you need to understand where you're at before you can make any changes to improve. So, yeah.
So we've actually done the a carbon footprint, or was it ecological footprint calculator?
Yes, we have.
So we're gonna discuss that now, and we're actually going to introduce for his first time on the podcast, Jerry, our producer.
Hello.
So how are you today?
I'm very good. It's a very interesting topic.
Any comments so far?
No, not really. Just that I'm getting more scared.
So did you do the calculator as well?
I did. It said that it takes me 4.5 planets every year. Like my resources are all done by April.
Yeah, I did that as well, and I got 3.4 Earths. So I would overshoot my overshoot day. Well, do you want to explain this a bit first before we?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the calculator that we're looking at, it's on their World Wildlife Fund website, and it asks you a bunch of questions about things like your diet and the types of food you eat, the house you live in, your energy usage, how much waste you generate, so how many new kind of products you buy each year. And at the end, it spits out, if everyone in the world lived like you do, how many Earths would we need to sustain everyone? And it also tells you, if everyone lived like you each year, at what point would we overshoot Earth's capacity to regenerate? So there's this concept of Earth Overshoot Day, and that's pretty much exactly that. If everyone, continued to live this way, at what point would we deplete Earth's resources each year? So it's been getting closer and closer to the start of the year since this concept first was around in the 70s. So back in the 70s, I think it used to be kind of around December, and then it's just crept back and back. And I've got a note here about when it was this year. I just have to find it. So in 2022, Earth Overshoot Day was July 28th.
Wow. So
we've already shot past that at just over halfway through the year. So just to put Jerry and Gabriella's results into perspective, the average Australian uses 4.5 Earths. So Jerry's right on target there.
I feel a little bit better then.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry, not meaning to, no disrespect to Jerry.
0.7 better.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. And I looked at a couple of other countries as well where I know the podcast might be streamed. So the average person in the United Arab Emirates uses 5.1 Earths. The average Malaysian person uses 2.7. And the average Romanian person uses 2.3 Earths. So,
okay, so there are some countries where it's much less. I mean, I guess 2.2 Earths is still too many.
Exactly.
What countries, if you know those, what countries do you know don't overshoot or around about the 1 mark?
So I think pretty much every country actually does overshoot. I'm just having a look at Earth Overshoot Day to find out when in 2022, the predicted overshoot day that's kind of closest to the end of the year is December 20, and that's for Jamaica.
Okay. I mean, that's a pretty good effort from Jamaica.
That's pretty close. It's only, a few weeks off. So good work. Good work, Jamaica. But yeah, places like Australia, Canada, United States, the Emirates, they're all kind of right up there in terms of Earth Overshoot Day. So in Australia, our overshoot day this year was actually March 23rd.
Wow. That's barely the year.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a quarter of the way through the year. So it's pretty abysmal by Australia. And that's because we rely a lot on coal-powered electricity, which is a very inefficient way of generating electricity that's very emissions intensive. So just to share my own results. So I obviously think about this topic a lot, and I'm definitely not perfect, but I do try my best to live as sustainably as I can. Sorry. If everyone lived like me, we would still need 1.4 Earths. So definitely some improvements to be made there. And my personal Earth overshoot day is 24th of September. So I pretty much don't eat any animal products. Obviously, I try not to use my heater too much. I try not to generate food waste. I try not to drive too much, but even still, we'd need 1.4 Earths. And it honestly, if you live particularly in a Western country, it is impossible to get below 1 Earth. And I think that ties into what we were talking about before about things that are within our own levers of control. I personally can't go out there and dismantle the coal-fired power plants. I can't directly change where my electricity comes from. I do purchase 100% renewable or green power electricity, so my emissions there are offset. But even still, we'd still need 1.4 Earths. So
yeah, it's a bit disheartening, I guess, to know that we can't actually live within our means, I guess. Because you're someone who your job is based on doing this, and if you can't do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really hard. And, we talked about for Australians, we have inefficient electricity generation, but for someone in the UAE, accessing fresh, locally grown produce is going to be a challenge just by virtue of the climate. So, there are little things you can do there, like you could grow some veggies or herbs or something maybe indoors, but definitely not enough to sustain you. So it is really challenging. There's only so much we as individuals can do. And I think it just reiterates the importance of using your voice and your money to vote.
Yeah, definitely. So what else can we do, I guess? You mentioned you don't eat a lot of meat.
Yeah, I think...
Or you don't eat any animal products, I guess.
Yeah, for the most part. I will admit my grandparents live in East Gippsland, and they brought me back some beautiful Gippsland honey the other day. So, I'm not I'm not infallible. That was too tempting. But yeah, one of the biggest things that I think people don't realise is just how emissions intensive things like red meat and dairy are. So it's not only the land use, of cows need to eat, they need to be grazing on grass, they take up a lot of room to do that. But cows actually generate methane when they burp, which is another form of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're actually contributing directly to climate change as well. Not that we blame them, cows are very cute, but if you can cut down on your red meat consumption and your dairy consumption, that's already a huge amount of emissions saved. And I'm not saying you have to go vegan. Again, we talked about, that's something that's relatively easy in Melbourne, but it's not everywhere else, and it's more expensive, and it is a bit of a privilege to be able to achieve. But even if you try having a vegetarian meal one day a week instead of eating red meat, that would make a huge dent in your emissions. You know, you're cutting out, if you have one veggie meal a week, that's 52 veggie meals for the year. So that's quite a simple thing I think people can do. And it's very achievable as well.
Something that I sort of notice, I try to balance my meat consumption, sort of do at least half and half or so.
Yeah.
But something I have noticed is if you're buying like a veggie burger, there's a lot of packaging there. Or if you're buying a lot of those, I guess products come with just a lot of packaging.
Yes.
And that can be a big issue. You know, you're trying to eat healthy and you're trying to eat sustainably, trying to eat more vegetable or plant-based products, but then you're left with all this plastic at the end. Do you have any suggestions for that, or is it just something that we have to demand from the companies?
I think it's a bit of both, and it's a really good point. 20 years ago, we wouldn't have seen fresh produce in plastic packaging necessarily. It's become, I think, a real reflection of easy consumption kind of culture and convenience foods. So, again, I don't have anyone else to cook for. So, I really feel for people with families who are trying to balance work and cooking healthy and taking care of their kids. Like, that obviously makes things harder. So I think it's a balance. A lot of local grocers will have plastic-free produce, or at least reduced compared to the stereotypical kind of supermarkets where, sometimes you can't buy specific kinds of produce that aren't, in a plastic container wrapped in soft plastic. So there is a couple of, if you really can't avoid the plastic, in Australia, we do have soft plastics recycling options. One of the biggest ones is RedCycle, and they often have collection points around supermarkets, or local council buildings sometimes have them as well. So if you absolutely can't avoid the plastic, or if the plastic-free option's too expensive, you can just collect those soft plastics and drop them off to one of those collection points. And they'll be recycled and made into things like park benches. They can even be a component of new roads as well. So at least they're getting reused for something. But yeah, it's always, if you can, it's best to avoid the plastic rather than recycle it.
Okay, yeah. And is recycling good?
Yeah.
Does it work?
I mean, it's a tough one. Recycling is obviously better than things going to landfill, and plastics in landfill take thousands and thousands of years to break down. So we obviously want to avoid that situation. But I think it's hard because recycling has to be done correctly for it to have any real benefit. And talking about, both of us have said we live in apartment buildings. At my apartment building, we have shared recycling bins that everyone uses. And the amount of times I find things that shouldn't be in the recycling bins in there, I'm sure my neighbours think I'm really weird, because if I do see something that shouldn't be in there, I'll just grab it out and put it in the correct bin. But if a recycling bin is more than about 5% contaminated, so say, for example, someone's accidentally put some rubbish that can't be recycled into a recycling bin, when the waste contractor comes to pick up the bins, if they have a look and they determine that more than about 5% of that bin is contaminated, it gets diverted to landfill. So that makes it hard when you're not entirely in control of that, if you have neighbours, if you have shared bins. So, there's this thing called the waste hierarchy, which is avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle, and then finally dispose. So you kind of want to follow that. Like, for example, my old phone recently died, and I was thinking about, what am I going to do? Like, I know there's kind of precious metals and things in this phone. I looked into getting it repaired, but it was just too far gone. I always have like fairly old phones. I tend to use them until they fall apart. But I was thinking, do I buy a new phone? And then I looked into refurbished phones. So they're phones that have been previously used and then someone has professionally, cleaned them and touched them up. And, my phone that I have is pretty much as good as new. There's a few little scratches and things, but that's an example of reusing something rather than buying new. And I dropped my old phone off at our council offices in Dandenong. Actually, we have a phone collection point. So I dropped my old phone off to go to a recycling plant to be disassembled. The metals and things within the phone will be reused and will go into a new phone in the future. So,
yeah, I definitely, I kept all my old phones for years because I was like, I know you're not supposed to put them in the bin, but I don't know where to put them. And then eventually I found that my council does also take them.
oh, great.
Same with also batteries. So I took down all of my old, went down one day with like a bag full of batteries and like old phones and all that technology, and I dropped them all off. And that was such a good feeling.
Good work.
But I never thought of buying a refurbished phone. Like I buy secondhand lots of things, but I've never thought about buying secondhand electronics. So that's a really great option.
Yeah, and again, it ties back into the cost-saving component that we talked about before. If you're willing to have a phone that is maybe a couple of years out of date, that might have some light scratches and things, like I got a Google Pixel because it has a really good camera. And, it cost about a quarter of what it would cost new. So that was a real benefit for me.
And the thing is that I will scratch the phone anyway.
Exactly. Yes, me too. Notoriously clumsy, constantly dropping things.
Yeah. I always have a screen protector on mine, and every time, as soon as I put it on, I drop it, screen protector breaks, I just leave it.
Well, it's doing its job.
Exactly. So we also talked a little bit earlier about what renters can do. So what other things can renters do? If we can't put more insulation in, we can't change the heaters, what can we do?
I think the first thing you can do is have a chat to your landlord or your real estate agent. It can be really hard. You can't just directly go and change these things, but you can advocate for yourself. The worst they can say is no. So you've really got nothing to lose. In Australia at the moment, there are quite a few grants offered by various state governments for energy efficiency upgrades that can be accessed by renters. You still need permission from the landlord, but once you've got that, you just can kind of roll with it. So we've heard anecdotally that has been helpful for people renting because, the owner of the building wants to make a nice investment. They want the value of their property to increase. If you're saying to them, hey, there's a grant where we can get a reverse system AC unit installed, it won't cost you anything, can you just sign this piece of paper? Chances are they're going to say yes, because they don't have to do anything or pay anything, and it's going to increase the value of their property. So I think that's one way of framing it. I think other options, there's a few that seem a little bit janky, but they do help. And I remember one of the first share houses I was living in, it was this old house from probably the 1920s. There were like very visible holes through the walls into the outside. It was like a tent. It was so cold. And you can do things like taping bubble wrap to your windows, which sounds really silly. It does help though.
Okay.
That's a really kind of low budget DIY way that you can insulate. You can get heavier curtains for your rooms as well. So that's one of the best ways you can keep heat inside. A lot of these old apartments or houses that tend to be occupied by renters will have single glazed windows. So they leak a lot of heat out of them. If you can cover that up, that will really help. You can also get some gap filler from a hardware store. Go around and have a look if there's any gaps in the window frames and things like that. You can patch them up. Probably would just check in with your real estate agent before doing that. They probably won't care, but always a good idea to ask rather than get in trouble.
Something that I actually realized that there were some cracks in my under the window frame. So I actually sent pictures to the landlord and I was like, hey, I don't know if this is an issue. And then next time that I called them to fix something more urgent, they were like, oh, we'll come and do that at the same time.
Oh, that's great.
And I didn't realize that would make that it would change the heating situation in the apartment because it was in the summer.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, I can see through to the outside. I don't think that's a good idea.
Probably not great.
So that's why I had it done. But, now I'm thinking, should I just inspect everywhere and just, or, is the landlord required to maybe inspect and make sure that everything is airtight? Or is that not something that's required?
I think probably more so in new developments, it definitely is. But in existing buildings, probably not. It is what it is. What you sign the lease on is kind of what you get. But it is good that when you flag that with your landlord, they did correct it. I think especially for things like that, it is very low cost for them to address as well. So I think it's something you'd have a lot more success with if you just ask. And yeah, gap filler tends to be fairly cheap as well. So if you did want to do it yourself with the landlord's permission, hopefully it wouldn't cost you too much either.
Unless there was a really big gap, in which case you might have bigger issues.
Yeah, well, that house I was talking about before had a hole that possums used to come in and out, and they lived in the walls. So, it was nice communicating with nature.
Yeah.
A little bit of entertainment.
Yes, I'm sure they were very entertained by you.
I just wish they paid rent.
Yeah. Any other tips for renters?
I think that's probably pretty much it. I think, again, just use your voice. The worst thing they can say is no. And if you do Google, energy saving tips for renters, you'll find a bunch of things that come up. And that study that I mentioned earlier in the episode about renters and heating and energy shock over winter has some further resources that you can look into as well.
Yes, I'm very interested in reading that.
Yes, it was a good read. Bit grim, but interesting.
Okay, I'll make sure I read it just before I read a nice book.
Good idea. Or make sure your cat's nearby. Have a nice cuddle.
Yes, have my my heater on me.
Yes, exactly, directly on you. Very energy efficient.
Anything else that you'd like to touch on?
I think I really would encourage people to try more plant-based food if you can. A lot of people are worried it won't taste good, or, what you said before about a lot of veggie burgers and things like that having packaging is really valid. I think when I first went vegetarian when I was 17, I ate a lot of frozen oven chips because I come from an Aussie family, and, it's the kind of meat and three veg. We don't season our food. It's all very bland. It's a stereotype for a reason. And then I discovered that other cultures and cuisines are delicious, and spice is good. And a lot of countries have cuisines that accidentally vegetarian or vegan. So Indian food is fantastic, Mexican food, a lot of Southeast Asian food. once you get into curries and stir fries and things, like you don't have to worry about it not being tasty. It's going to be good.
So the other thing is a lot of those sort of meat replacements, not just veggie burgers, but things like those sausages or like the minces, are they better for the environment than eating meat?
It's a really interesting question.
Because they seem very processed and just like, I don't even know what's in them. It's like ground soy with a bunch of
Yeah.
different things, and it doesn't seem very natural.
Yeah, that's true. I think I get the impression that if you had a look at, the resources required to make those things, then the resources that go into the packaging, they're probably not going to come from your local neighborhood. So there's transport emissions to get them to the store where you're buying them as well. I'd be really interested to look at a comparison of all of those emissions versus if you ate a hamburger, for example. And I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I'm sure someone's probably done the math there. So
Yeah, and particularly like a hamburger that was made from a cow that was grown in Victoria, I guess.
exactly, yeah.
And comparing those two.
Yeah, that's true. I'll have to do some research after we finish up and let you know.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something I'd be very interested in. We might have already sort of touched this a little bit, but what do you do in your own home to make it sustainable?
Yeah, I guess we've touched on it a little bit, but I think just trying to avoid packaging as much as possible, trying to support local business. I'm lucky enough that we have a grocer that's a 5-minute walk from me that does a lot of kind of naked food. Not a lot of packaging, comes from Victoria, so locally grown. And working at Dandenong as well, we've got the amazing Dandenong Market right nearby, and that has hundreds of vendors from Victoria selling produce that they've grown themselves. So it's also very affordable. And if you take your own bags, pretty much everything is plastic free as well. So I think that's definitely something that's important to me. I try to use the greywater friendly products like we talked about before, and just being really mindful of water, being really mindful of heating and cooling my home. I've got my worm farm, so I no longer have to send any waste to landfill, which is great. And where I can't avoid plastic packaging, I do collect it and recycle it as well. So typically, I only have one small bag of rubbish that goes to landfill probably about once a month.
Wow.
So it is possible. And again, it takes time and a bit of effort to figure out. But I think if everyone just does their best and gives it a go, we'll get there. Something else that I do that I think may be helpful is I meal prep. So about once a month, I'll set aside an entire Sunday and just cook a bunch of different meals, like 4 or 5. And I think for me, because I live alone and I'm just cooking for myself, it can be really hard to eat like 4 serves of a meal before it goes off. So I found meal prepping really helpful because I'll freeze things kind of in single servings and then just defrost them as I need throughout the week. So I can have 5 different meals each week. I won't get bored of what I'm eating. It definitely is a big incentive for me to take those meals into work for lunch rather than buying takeaway or anything like that. And it also means your food won't go off or spoil before you've had the chance to eat it. And like we said before, if things are looking like they're just about to turn and go off, things like the basil that we talked about before, there's a lot of ways you can preserve them to use in the future. And one of the biggest things that actually I only learnt a couple of months ago was you can use glass jars to store things and you can put them in the freezer. I always thought that they'd break in the freezer, but turns out you just have to like chill them first in the fridge.
Okay.
So if you put them in the fridge for 12 hours or so and then move them to the freezer, they're totally fine.
Okay.
It's just if it's going from room temperature straight to the freezer, the temperature shock is too much and the glass will shatter. But since then, like I keep all of my glass jars if I need to buy them, and I freeze just single serves of meals in there. I make smoothies just with whatever's kind of lying around in my fridge. And yeah, it means that food waste is really drastically cut down. So that's been really helpful for me.
I love some of these suggestions because definitely something that we end up doing is we end up throwing a lot of like veggies. I'm like, buying mandarins thinking I'm going to eat them. I'm going to eat them. And then I never actually eat them.
Yes, exactly.
I've got a question about this because, I also meal prep. So I think I don't produce much food waste. But there are like meal kit services that are really popular now.
Yes.
Right. And I think it's really good for like reducing food waste because they give you the exact amount of ingredients that you need. But we had a guest before that talked about food delivery and its impact. And how like is meal kit services like really that much better, or like because of like the delivery and packaging that they might do? I don't know if they use a lot of plastic, but
Yeah.
what's your opinion on that, like with the meal kit stuff?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And again, it's something that's kind of only popped up in the last couple of years. For the most part, from what I've seen, the benefit of them is exactly what you said. It's cutting down on food waste. And oftentimes, a lot of the food is from the state in which it's being delivered. So you're cutting down on kind of transport miles there. But of course, it actually has to get delivered directly to your house as well. So I think I typically don't use them super often just because of all the plastic that goes along with that. However, I think, for someone who's really busy, who has a family, I think they're a lifesaver, and they can work really well. I think, they're not terrible for the environment and they're not great for the environment either. I think, you just have to do what works for you, acknowledging that everyone's life is a little bit different. And if a meal kit service means that you're eating a lot of fresh food, you're not wasting food, you're able to easily feed your family something healthy and save some time, then I think that's great. And if it works for you, then you do you.
That's good to hear because I don't use them, but occasionally I look at them. I'm like, oh, it'd be so good if I just didn't have to think about dinner tonight.
Exactly. Well, that's, like we said before, the kind of mental load of having the time to go and collect things and kind of prepare ahead of time to be more sustainable. If that meal kit service takes that kind of out of the equation for you and it works, then give it a go.
Yeah. So we've got some questions from the audience now.
Great.
So our first question is how much can one individual actually contribute to reducing climate change when there are large companies polluting the environment?
Yeah, really great question. I think it can feel really overwhelming sometimes thinking about just the scope of what's happening and the amount of work we have ahead of us. And I know, I'm not immune to it either. Sometimes I can feel really frustrated or a bit hopeless about the situation. But I think of just, if everyone thought that way, if everyone kind of gave up, it would have a big impact around the world. There's 6.5 billion of us on this planet.
Seven
now.
To 8. Oh, close to 8.
Yeah.
We've got Jerry on the fact checking. Thank you, Jerry. And that number's growing all the time. So if you think about if everyone made some of those choices that you're making to be more sustainable, it would have a massive impact. But I think at the same time, just recognizing that corporations and governments really have to pull their weight as well. And I think it was last week or so that there was some controversy around celebrities and their private jets. So when you think about it that way, I think one of the biggest benefits of practicing a sustainable lifestyle is that it's a conversation starter for others. And if you're able to demonstrate that, it's not really all that hard, that it is achievable, that you don't have to do it perfectly, just make small changes, one change at a time, that's going to have a ripple effect throughout your community and through your family and your friend groups. And it will get people thinking about it and talking about it. Can you imagine if everyone suddenly pulled their money out of a bank that was investing in new coal projects and switched to a bank that was investing in solar panels instead? That would have a massive influence on climate change. So, yeah, I think it's all about context, just trying your best and, remembering that there's only so much you can do. So be kind to yourself.
That's nice to hear because, sometimes I do feel a bit, disheartened by the fact that, sure, I can, catch the train to work every day instead of driving, but there's some company out there that's polluting, or there's some celebrities taking their private jet wherever they like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe one day I'll be an incredibly rich and famous person who decides not to have a private jet.
Yeah, maybe you'll have a sailing yacht or something instead. You'll have to invite me on board.
Yes, one day. Actually, question 2 has been answered already, but Jerry had some questions.
Sure.
So Gabriella brought it to me, and then I tried to fact check it by going to Woolies. She told me that oat milk came from Sweden or something.
Well, the oat milk that I got was from Sweden, and I think that probably a lot of those alternative milks probably do come from overseas.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I went to Woolies and I checked it, and most of the milk said 100% Australian. And this is kind of actually like one of my other questions is like how to identify what's actually Australian, because I found out that oat milk is grown in Australia, but then it's shipped to Italy to be processed.
Yes.
And then back. But I saw news that they are trying to process it in Australia now. I think Perth was the first one. But in terms of that, so if Australia's got like really good, a big industry, and we are one of the biggest exporters of dairy milk, would the alternative of, going to Italy and then back to Australia be better than dairy milk?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I do remember reading about the oat milk dilemma a couple of months ago when I was doing some research for the same reason. And it's really common not just with non-dairy milk, but with other products as well. You'll see like grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand, then shipped to Australia. And don't even get me started on the water consumption of various non-dairy milks as well, because that's a different consideration. I think that's a really tough one. And I'm sure, again, someone probably has done the maths and the emissions calculations between growing something here, shipping it overseas to be packed and then back versus, consuming dairy milk from a cow that's grown up in Victoria. I feel like the travel emissions on the oat milk would probably come out higher. I won't say that for sure, though. But when I first made the switch away from dairy milk to non-dairy milk, trying to cut down on those food emissions, I was doing all this research and it was so confusing.
I think that's the problem with a lot of people. It's really confusing. Yeah.
Exactly. What I found, though, and this was the case when I last checked a couple of months ago when I ran into the oat milk question, soy milk from soybeans grown in Australia is currently the lowest emission non-dairy milk that you can get. So if you can find soy milk in the shops, just have a look and make sure it is 100% Australian.
That's what I drink.
Oh, nice, nice. Soy buds.
I know. I think almond is the highest in terms of water and maybe land as well. But soy is like the bottom.
Yes.
So yeah. But I want to know though, if there a way for like us living in Australia, at least, because we don't know how it's like in other countries.
Yeah, true.
Is there like a label, or how do you find out that, everything is done in Australia?
Yeah, so sometimes it's not super clear. We do have a labelling scheme in Australia that gives you the percentage of the product that was grown in Australia. And normally it will say if the product has been packaged elsewhere. I'm not sure off the top of my head if that's a mandatory requirement. It's just what I've noticed when I've been doing research. But typically, there's quite a few communities that practice sustainability, or particularly for people who are interested in more plant-based food, there's vegan communities and things online where those questions are asked and people will go so far as to contact the company, get a response, and then share it with everyone on the forum. So, when in doubt, give it a Google and see what you can find. There's a lot of information out there and it can feel overwhelming, when you're just starting that journey and you're trying to cut down on things. It feels like you have to do so much research to find out what's right. And that's why I always say, don't do too much too soon. If you want change to stick, just make simple changes, one change at a time. You don't have to immediately go fully vegan and never use your heating again and only walk everywhere. Just try switching to soy milk for a bit, or have a veggie meal a week.
That's what I do at Woolies. Like whenever I try something new, I have to stand in the aisle, Google it for 10 minutes.
Exactly.
And avoid hitting people. So, yeah.
That's why it's good to go at 10 o'clock at night. Like we said before, it's a bit quieter.
Yeah. Well, to touch on, the whole baby steps thing. And that's kind of what I did. I cut beef out of my diet. I still eat chicken and different seafood.
Yeah.
I cut beef because I saw that's the worst one.
Yeah.
And that's one I can do without. And it's also the most expensive one. So
that's true. Win-win.
Yeah, win-win. Although me and my partner have been discussing sustainability stuff and just eating meat in general. One of our worries, and I think most people can sympathize with this, is that you don't really know how much what you're doing is doing in the grand scheme of things. So is there any data on how, because we've seen a big trend of people going vegan or vegetarian or just cutting meat. Is there a data on what it's done to the meat or dairy industry, on if it's impacted, if it's actually done a change with have they been producing less or anything like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I would imagine just kind of extrapolating from a study I saw a couple of months ago about the increasing rates of vegetarian and veganism, that it probably has had an impact. But in terms of kind of facts and figures, I'm not too sure. I just know, I think the figures were something like back in the 90s, it was kind of 1 in 50 people were vegetarian. Now it's kind of more like 1 or 2 in 10. So it is getting more and more common.
It's a big change.
Yeah, exactly. And even just from personal experience, I first went vegetarian when I was 17, and there was very limited kind of alternatives out there. When I was in high school, I did an exchange abroad in Germany, and that was almost impossible even just to be vegetarian because they love their meat over in Deutschland. And it was difficult. And then when I last went back 5 or so years ago, suddenly everyone was like, yeah, I'm vegan, and like all the supermarkets had all these alternatives, and there was soy milk and stuff everywhere. So yeah, it definitely, just anecdotally, I think there would be a real impact, but it would be interesting to research and find some actual facts and figures. So I'll add that to my list of things to look up after this.
I think Jessica's coming back.
Part 2.
And I think we'll have a really big notes section.
Possibly,
in
yeah.
the notes section, yeah. So we're going to do the open mic now. You wanted to, was there anything you wanted to talk about?
I think I was just going to talk about giving more plant-based foods a try. But I think we've covered off on that really nicely. So I might just switch it up a little bit.
Yeah.
I think something that, people are struggling with in this space is that feeling of being helpless and unable to make a difference. And I know, in my field, people who work in the climate change space, we have this thing called climate fatigue, where we're exposed to it constantly. It's a lot of doom and gloom a lot of the time, and sometimes we can get a little bit downtrodden and, feel a bit frustrated, I guess, with the state of the world. And I just wanted to share something that has really helped me. I've started going to tree planting days. So we run them through our council, through our wonderful parks team. And there was one recently at the Dandenong Wetlands. And just the feeling of physically doing something that is going to help with carbon sequestration, is going to provide habitat for the wildlife of the area, and just being around like-minded people who care about the environment, who want to do something to help, who are all, volunteering their time to be there. I've been going to these events kind of every couple of weeks, just to boost my morale and keep the motivation up. It really is healing, I think, to be in nature. So highly encourage anyone who's feeling a bit stuck or frustrated or wondering what the point is with sustainability. Just go out, get in nature, go for a hike, go for a walk, look at a tree. Just we still have so many beautiful places in this world. And yeah, I think it can be really healing. So get out there and enjoy it.
I think living in the city, sometimes I forget to go out into nature.
Yes.
So that's a really good reminder.
Definitely.
I'll see if I can make some time this weekend.
Good idea.
Thank you. So if people want to find out more about you, where should they go?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I will warn you, Jessica Harrison is an extremely common name. But if you search Jessica Harrison and Dandenong, it should show up. If not, you can also find my contact details on the South East Council's Climate Change Alliance website, which is secca, secca.org.au.
And we'll have all of this information in the show notes as well, so you can find it nice and easy. Well, thank you, Jess, for joining me today. It was really great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and any other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, sharing, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people to find it so we can grow and continue to bring you quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Yastra. Thanks for tuning in.